The rifles rested against the trees and the eye searched through the sights, trying to discern the targets. They were special forces operators moving to the enemy's rear to make casualties. The sabotage group needed to stop the Russian army in the cities. The drones flew close to residential buildings to turn homes into ruins. Parents desperately waited for news of their sons with low ranks. At the front, battle comrades often didn't have the same patience with their wounded friends. They moved on to combat while the wounded tried to keep up with them in a pitiful way. The other soldiers looked for the drones in the sky, fleeing, perhaps too late, from the death being delivered. Russian missiles flew over Kyiv. The explosions served to terrorize soldiers, families, and authorities. At dawn, the attack continued. Russian drones approached in a calm flight toward the buildings. The smoke caused by the impacts of their brothers had already spread across Kyiv. People filmed more impressed than scared, as it had become routine. The explosion finally snapped the Ukrainians out of their stupor and made screams of terror echo. It was just another day of Russian attacks in Kyiv. Drones and missiles hit military and civilian targets, resulting in more obituaries. In mid-June of 2025, buildings collapsed on people, filling the streets with worry and fear. That wasn't even had a month in the third year of the war. Desperate parents watched the firefighters at work while waiting for news of their son. Buried under the rubble caused by the Russian attack, their minds went crazy with anticipation for news. Their hearts at the same time hoping for the best and living through the worst. When the news came, their strength left their bodies. There was nothing to do except cry and feel anger over the loss of a son. It was just another day in Ukraine with bad news for Ukrainians, but good news for Russians. In those days of June 2025, the Russians were making a strong advance on the border of Sumy Oblast with Russia. Meanwhile, in Donetsk Oblast, the Russian wave continued its path of destruction, engulfing Ukrainian villages and their soldiers. The news was bad for Kyiv, which saw Donetsk as practically lost, while Pokrovsk was on its way to being flanked and facing the same fate. The Ukrainian forces tried to resist. One of their main goals was to prevent the new SUM front from becoming a disaster, like in Donetsk, and, at the very least, to make it a martyrdom for the Russians. What was Kharkiv like in 2024? The Russian drone operators prepared their combat machines, tightening their wiring and securing the explosives, like rocket-propelled grenade rounds, mortar grenades, or even improvised explosive devices with small charges of plastic explosive, like C4. These kamikazes were used not only against soldiers or vehicles, but also against the heavy Ukrainian drones that hunted the Russians, dropping grenades or heavy explosives. The kamikazes had several tasks on the battlefield. In short, the Russians needed them to eliminate as many enemies as possible so that the invasion could continue. Of course, all with the help of artillery, a key piece in any of Moscow's military strategies. On the Ukrainian side, the operators had heavy hexacopter drones in their arsenal, which greatly worried the Russians. That's why they tried to shoot them down as soon as they saw them. Called Vampire by Kyiv and Babyaga by Moscow, they carried several explosives to the trenches. The bombs fell on the trenches and houses where the Russians had set up bases. The Vampire carried several explosives dropping them one by one as needed to cause as many casualties as possible. Its size was a big advantage to the point that it could take down smaller drones just by touching them. Russian officers ordered their soldiers to persist in their advances. Ukrainian shelling tried to stop all these groups that were moving through the villages of Sumy. There were many of them trying to spread out over an area of about 187 square kilometers. That was the equivalent of 26 football fields. That left little room for the Russians when talking about an invading force of thousands of soldiers, and made it easier for the Ukrainians to look for targets. The strategy of sending motorcycle squads didn't help much in Sumy, even though it had been successful in other areas of the front. The strike from a drone, combined with a violent crash of a high-speed vehicle, almost always meant death. The one from the 125th Ukrainian Assault Battalion filmed the Russians desperate in the open field, being torn apart by the continuous artillery strikes. It was pure terror trying to survive so many attacks. Running through the bushes didn't help much when there were so many drones in the sky. The wounded who survived the artillery just watched the propellers buzzing above while grenades fell to finish their fate. Little by little, the bodies marked a trail where these squads tried to pass, showing how they died. Little by little, trying to reach their destination, they became a morbid line of corpses who found only the departure of their souls. But the Russians had more to send into this battle. Moscow's drones kept flying over Sumy. One of them approached a Ukrainian T-64 tank. After spy drones found it in the middle of a line of trees,
finishing off the enemy armored vehicle.
Other larger drones relentlessly crashed down on the houses where the Ukrainian soldiers were, like precise hammers smashing their target. The Kyiv fighters tried to prepare the trenches for this Russian advance. The Moscow soldiers would arrive right after the bombardment. The problem was surviving the multiple rocket launchers that unleashed fury during the night. They were nightmares falling from the skies, ruining any chance of rest. It was almost useless to try to use the night for protection. The thermal lenses could see the soldiers. The drones up above were sometimes not even heard, while their explosives were carried by gravity to explode on the bodies of the Ukrainians. The soldiers became disoriented, seeing their friends disappear into the darkness and hearing only their groans. Pain, screams, explosions, and final breaths were the sounds of that night. Some wounded men stood still, waiting for their final moments. Others crawled, but the drone didn't let them move far, forcing them to die alongside their companions. Ukrainian special forces, like Omega, were very active in Sumy. Their dangerous missions took them behind enemy lines. Those were difficult times for those soldiers. There was no special training that could prepare a man enough for the horror of war. When a vehicle was hit hard by the drones, they had to disembark immediately, with the certainty that this was not the only harbinger of death lurking in the skies. There were others getting ready to hit softer targets than the armored vehicle. The flesh, then, had to flee from those predators as quickly as possible. From inside the trenches, the Special Forces operators used the 4600 grenade launchers to surprise the Russians, firing 40mm explosives up to 400 meters. The M249 light machine gun, well supported in the trench, was effective at an even greater distance than that. The main effect of a high-velocity projectile, like that of the M249 on human flesh, was not just the direct hole it created. The projectile pushed the tissue out of the way with tremendous force, creating a pulsating cavity that expanded and contracted. This cavity could be several times the diameter of the ammunition. The shock wave ruptured blood vessels and organs. The energy broke bones, causing explosive fragmentation that turned the bones into shrapnel, tearing through even more flesh. The Russians responded by using the maximum amount of violence they could against those trenches. The explosions caused by the airstrikes mainly came in the form of bombs. Fragmentation air bomb. One of the heaviest, the Fragmentation Air Bomb 3000, dropped its 3 tons on one of the Ukrainian defenses. Death spread with 100% lethality in the first 30 meters, practically vaporizing the bodies. The radius of destruction continued for 240 meters, obliterating everything in its path and sending shrapnel over a kilometer away. All that was left was a crater almost 3 meters deep. Explosions caused by the projectiles left by the drones were much less impressive, but they were not underestimated by the soldiers. They killed without completely destroying the bodies, but often left the men suffering in the middle of the woods, not knowing if there would be a rescue. A soldier experienced this firsthand every day in Ukraine. Sometimes, he was simply walking when he suspected the presence of the drone. Looking up didn't reveal much, with a tiny quadcopter almost disappearing high above. When the explosive was seen, it was already too late. A jump could save your life from a direct hit, but the shrapnel would enter your body, sometimes taking a while to be felt. But afterwards, the concern of the comrades was clear about the fate of their brother in arms. There were no alternatives except to wait for medical support. Russian power was truly terrifying, but the Ukrainians still persisted in the defense of Sumy. One of the reconnaissance and sabotage groups managed to cross the Russian line and reach the rear of the invading force. It was a small space to get in, but the smaller it was, the easier it was to find the targets. For the rifles, the gunpowder exploded, sending the projectiles and the sound of death through the forest. The silencers muffled the rifle shots, slowing down the Russian reaction to notice the sound of the gunfire. The soldiers moved among the trees, firing the rounds of ammunition, 5.56, using Special Forces rifles. The ammunition was designed to be unstable upon hitting the target. This meant that, upon entering the body, it tended to spin on its own axis, exposing a larger area of the bullet to the tissue and transferring more energy. The projectile pierced the flesh, leaving a permanent cavity. The expansion of energy from its passage created a large hole that expanded and contracted. As it contracted, the tissues deformed rapidly, causing even more damage. Meanwhile, the drones were exploding in the fields. Sometimes, the Russian was not lucky enough to hit the demon before it fell on his body. Some shrapnel that hit him made him continue on his way limping. Another drone was more precise, bringing his comrade down forever on Ukrainian soil. The Russian kept walking, after only glancing slightly back. It was like that, a hopeless time. One wounded man survived and was forced to crawl with his last strength, while his squad passed by him, thinking only of their own lives. And the soldier, still on all fours, persisted on the same path, heading toward the enemy trench, unarmed, continuing his mission. Ukrainian drones fell on the Russians throughout the month of June 2025. They couldn't give any rest to the enemies or to their equipment. Wherever the Russians were, an explosion was supposed to find them. Bases, trenches, and forest paths had to have drones watching them. The lenses had to be precise to identify the threat, keeping the observers in place for as long as possible. While the kamikazes and bomb launchers waited for the moment to fly against their targets, that's how the Sumy front was stopped. That offensive was even shorter-lived than the one in Kharkiv. The area was stalled, although the Ukrainians still recorded some gains in early July.
In the last days of June,
Russia intensified its offensive with deadly attacks, resuming the systematic use of missiles and kamikaze drones. On June 24th, bombings hit Dnipro and Samar, killing 21 people and devastating residential areas and hospitals. Russian drones also targeted the south, killing civilians on the roads. In the following days, Odessa, Kherson, and Samar were targeted again, with more deaths and urban destruction. Despite a few more cautious days, the pattern of terror persisted. The Kremlin claimed to be targeting military objectives, but the strikes on residential buildings, grain warehouses, and unarmed civilians increased international condemnation. Ukraine responded with a series of surgical strikes that hit military targets hard inside Crimea and Russian territory. Using drones and Storm Shadow missiles, Kyiv struck air bases, ammunition depots, and strategic infrastructure, such as refineries and railway bridges. In the early hours of June 24, the Ukrainian drone struck the Sako air base with brutal precision. A Pantsir S-1 exploded with its entire crew. The Protonivik, GE, Niobe UMSV, and Pekora 3 radars were destroyed in succession. Finally, an S-30 was reduced to wreckage before taking off. The base plunged into urban fire. On the night of June 27th to 28th, Ukraine struck 2 blows right at the heart of the Russian war machine. More than 1,300 kilometers from the border, Ukrainian drones hit the Izevsk electromechanical plant, which is crucial for the production of Russian missiles and drones. At the same time, the Kyiv air base in occupied Crimea was engulfed in flames. Mi-8, Mi-26, and Mi-28 helicopters were destroyed along with the Pantsir S-1 system. Secondary explosions swept through the facility throughout the early morning, a sign that ammunition stockpiles were being consumed by the fire. It was a night of relentless precision. Still, another constant reminder that, even without having all of Russia's power, Ukraine could still reach the invaders' exposed nerves. The Russians also blamed the Ukrainians for an incident that occurred in the neighboring city of Krasnogorsk. Moscow, a supposedly Ukrainian drone hit the upper floors of a residential building, causing a fire that injured 2 residents. The month of June ended as one of the worst for Ukraine against Russian strikes on its cities up to that point. Even with threats from the American president, with deadlines and more deadlines for Putin to stop the war. But at that point, the dog of war was already too used to feeding on human flesh on the fronts of Ukraine. As long as there was still food, he seemed content to keep barking and roaming the country. feeding on any soldier from any nation heading to the front.